In the summer of 1985, the small town of Blackthorne, nestled in the forested hills of northern Vermont near the Canadian border, was a place where life moved to the rhythm of country music drifting from open windows and the hum of pickup trucks on gravel roads. The air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the neon sign of Rosie's Diner flickered against the twilight, a beacon for locals gathering over coffee and homemade pie. Blackthorne was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's business, where trust was woven into the fabric of church suppers and volunteer fire department barbecues. But that summer, trust unraveled when two young deputies, Sarah Mitchell and Daniel Hayes, vanished without a trace during a routine patrol near the abandoned Blackthorne textile mill. Sarah, 26, was a hometown girl, her smile as bright as the wildflowers dotting the meadows. Daniel, 28, had moved to Blackthorne from Burlington, eager to prove himself as a deputy in the county sheriff's office. On July 12, 1985, they were dispatched to investigate reports of suspicious activity at the mill, a crumbling relic of the town's industrial past, its rusted machinery silent since the 1960s. The call came from a local teenager who claimed to have seen strange lights flickering inside. When Sarah and Daniel didn't report back by midnight, Sheriff Amos Reed sent a search party. Their patrol car was found parked near the mill, doors ajar, with a half-eaten sandwich on the passenger seat and their radio silent. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just an eerie absence that settled over Blackthorne like a fog. For weeks, the town buzzed with theories. Some whispered the deputies had run off together, a romantic scandal to spice up the gossip at Rosie's. Others speculated an accident. Perhaps they'd wandered into the dense woods and gotten lost, or fallen into the nearby Winooski River. A few old-timers muttered about smugglers using the mill as a waypoint for drugs coming across the Canadian border, a growing problem in the 1980s as Vermont's quiet backroads became conduits for contraband. Search parties scoured the forests, divers dragged the river, but no trace of Sarah or Daniel was found. The case went cold, a wound that never healed, etched into the town's memory alongside the twang of George Strait songs and the clatter of HS tapes at the local video store. 16 years later, in the fall of 2001, Blackthorne had changed little. The mill still loomed on the edge of town, its broken windows staring like empty eyes. The world outside was grappling with the aftermath of 9/11, but in Blackthorne, life clung to its small-town rhythms. Detective Margaret Maggie Callahan, 48, had returned to her hometown after a career in Montpelier State Police. Maggie was a Blackthorne native, raised on a dairy farm just outside town, where she'd spent her childhood sneaking cigarettes behind the barn and listening to her father's Johnny Cash records. Her sharp mind and stubborn streak had made her a standout investigator, but the loss of Sarah Mitchell, her high school friend, had haunted her. Maggie had been one of the last to see Sarah, sharing a laugh at Rosie's Diner the day before she vanished. The guilt of not solving the case had driven Maggie to leave Blackthorne years ago, but now, divorced and seeking a quieter life, she was back as the county's lead detective. On a crisp October morning, Maggie was at the sheriff's office, sorting through paperwork to the tune of Alan Jackson on the radio, when a call came in from Ed Ramsey, a 62-year-old retired mechanic and widower who spent his days fishing the Winooski. Ed had been poking around the mill, scavenging for scrap metal to sell, when he stumbled upon a rusted metal box half buried in the dirt near the mill's old boiler room. Inside was a sheriff's badge, Sarah Mitchell's, its silver star tarnished but unmistakable, and a small, water-damaged notebook. The notebook's pages were brittle, but a few entries were legible, written in Sarah's neat cursive. They mentioned late-night meetings at the mill and a name, Mr. Hale. Maggie's pulse quickened. Arthur Hale had been Blackthorne's beloved high school physics teacher in the 1980s, a soft-spoken man who'd retired in 1990 and still lived quietly on the edge of town. Why would Sarah mention him? Maggie drove to the mill, her boots crunching on the gravel as she surveyed the scene. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and the mill's shadowed interior felt like a tomb. Ed, wiry and weathered, stood by the boiler room, clutching a thermos of coffee. "Didn't think much of it at first," he said, his Vermont accent thick. "But that badge, it gave me the chills." Maggie bagged the evidence, her mind racing. The original investigation, led by Sheriff Reed, had dismissed the mill as a dead end, focusing instead on the runaway theory. But Sarah's notebook suggested something darker, something hidden. Maggie felt the weight of her friend's absence, the years of unanswered questions pressing down. She knew reopening the case would stir up old wounds, but she couldn't walk away. Back at the station, Maggie pored over the notebook's faded pages. One entry stood out. July 10th, 1985. Met Mr. Hale at the mill. He's scared. Says it's bigger than we think. Maggie's stomach churned. Hale had been a fixture in Blackthorne, coaching the science club and organizing the town's 4th of July fireworks. Could he have been involved in something criminal? As she cross-referenced old case files, she found a report from 1985 noting Hale's alibi. He'd been at a teachers' conference in Burlington the night Sarah and Daniel disappeared. It had never been questioned. Maggie's instincts screamed that the truth had been buried, perhaps deliberately. She needed to talk to Hale, but first, she had to assemble a team and tread carefully. Blackthorne was a small town, and secrets had a way of fighting back. That evening, as Maggie locked up the station, she noticed a pickup truck idling across the street, its headlights off. The driver's face was shadowed, but she felt eyes on her, cold and unyielding. She gripped her keys, her heart pounding, and hurried to her car. The truck didn't follow, but the message was clear. Someone didn't want this case reopened. As she drove home through the dark, forested roads, the glow of her dashboard radio playing an old Merle Haggard tune, Maggie knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. Sarah and Daniel deserved justice, and she'd tear Blackthorne apart to find it. The October air in Blackthorne, Vermont, carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, mingling with the scent of wood smoke from chimneys dotting the town's modest homes. In 2001, the world beyond Blackthorne was still reeling from the events of September. But here, the discovery of Sarah Mitchell's badge and notebook at the old textile mill had cracked open a wound 16 years in the making. Detective Maggie Callahan sat at her desk in the county sheriff's office, the faint hum of a space heater battling the chill. The radio played a low, mournful Willie Nelson tune, a reminder of the 1980s, when she and Sarah had been inseparable, sneaking into Rosie's diner to split a milkshake and dream of lives bigger than Blackthorne. Now, Maggie was determined to uncover what had happened to her friend and Deputy Daniel Hayes, no matter the cost. Maggie assembled a small team to tackle the reopened case. Her trusted partner was Deputy Tom Whitaker, a lanky 35-year-old with a dry sense of humor and a knack for noticing details others missed. Tom had grown up in Blackthorne, his father a logger who'd worked the forests near the Canadian border. She also brought in Dr. Ellen Park, a forensic specialist from Montpelier, whose expertise in analyzing degraded evidence would be crucial. Ellen, in her early 40s, had a sharp mind and a no-nonsense demeanor, her glasses perpetually sliding down her nose as she pored over samples. The trio met in the station's cramped conference room, the table cluttered with coffee mugs and faded files from 1985. Maggie laid out Sarah's badge and notebook, the artifacts glowing under the fluorescent light like relics of a lost era. The notebook's entries were sparse but chilling. Sarah had written about meetings at the mill and mentioned Arthur Hale, the former physics teacher, multiple times. One entry, dated July 8, 1985, read, "Hale says it's not just drugs. Kids are involved. I don't know who to trust." Maggie's blood ran cold. Kids. Blackthorne had seen a string of missing children in the early 1980s, mostly runaways or custodial disputes. But a few cases had never been solved. The idea that Sarah and Daniel's disappearance might be tied to something so sinister made Maggie's stomach churn. She shared the entries with Tom and Ellen, who exchanged uneasy glances. "This changes everything," Ellen said, adjusting her glasses. If Sarah was onto something involving kids, it wasn't just a random disappearance. Maggie turned to Ed Ramsey, the retired mechanic who'd found the box. Ed, with his weather hands and flannel jacket, was a Blackthorne institution, known for fixing cars at his garage before arthritis slowed him down. He sat across from Maggie at Rosie's diner, the jukebox playing an old Patsy Cline song as the smell of fried onions filled the air. Ed recounted his discovery. I was scavenging for copper pipes at the mill. Thought I'd make a few bucks. Then I saw that box, half buried like someone didn't want it found." He paused, his eyes distant. "Sarah was my daughter's friend. Used to come over for supper. Finding her badge, it felt like she was asking for help." Maggie nodded, touched by Ed's sincerity. He wasn't just a witness. He was a link to the community's heart, a reminder of why this case mattered. The team's first move was to re-examine the 1985 investigation. Sheriff Amos Reed, now retired and living in a cabin outside town, had led the original case. His reports were meticulous, but oddly narrow, focusing on the runaway theory despite no evidence of Sarah or Daniel planning to leave. Maggie found a buried note in the files. A deputy had reported seeing a dark van near the mill the night of the disappearance, but Reed had dismissed it as irrelevant. Why? Maggie's instincts told her the investigation had been steered away from the truth. She sent Tom to pull records on the mill's ownership, while Ellen began analyzing the notebook for fingerprints or trace evidence. The badge, polished and bagged, sat on Maggie's desk, a silent accusation. Tom returned with a lead. The mill had been owned by a holding company tied to a Burlington businessman, Victor Crane, who'd made a fortune in real estate during the 1980s. Crane had connections to local officials, including Judge Harlan Booth, who'd served on the county court in 1985. Booth was a pillar of Blackthorne society, his name on the library and the annual 4th of July parade. Could he have been involved in burying the case? Maggie's mind raced to Sarah's mention of kids. She cross-referenced missing persons reports from the 1980s and found 3 unsolved cases of teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, aged 14 to 16, who'd vanished from Blackthorne between 1983 and 1985. The files were thin, with no mention of the mill or Hale. It felt like a deliberate omission. Maggie decided to visit Arthur Hale. The former teacher, now in his late 60s, lived in a modest house on the edge of town, its yard overgrown with weeds. Hale greeted her with a nervous smile, his hands trembling as he offered her tea. "I heard about the badge," he said, his voice soft. "Terrible thing. What happened to those deputies?" Maggie probed gently, asking about his time at Blackthorne High. Hale spoke fondly of his students, but when she mentioned the mill, his face paled. "I don't know anything about that," he stammered, avoiding her eyes. Maggie didn't push, but his reaction confirmed her suspicions. Hale was hiding something. As she left Hale's house, Maggie noticed a familiar pickup truck parked down the street, the same one she'd seen outside the station the night before. Its engine rumbled to life as she approached her car, and it sped off into the dusk, tires kicking up gravel. Her heart pounded, the memory of 1980s country roads and the fear of being followed flashing back. She called Tom, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Someone's watching us," she said. "This goes deeper than we thought." Back at the station, Ellen called with a breakthrough. The notebook had traces of soil unique to the mill's boiler room, suggesting it had been hidden there deliberately. But whose fingerprints were on it? And why had Hale's name appeared in Sarah's notes? That night, Maggie sat in her farmhouse, the glow of a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. The radio played a Reba McEntire song, its melancholy chords stirring memories of Sarah's laughter. Maggie opened a box of old photos, finding one of her and Sarah at a 1984 town fair, their arms around each other, the Ferris wheel glowing behind them. She traced Sarah's face, vowing to find the truth. But as she turned off the lamp, she heard a creak outside, a footstep on the porch. Her hand went to her service weapon, her pulse racing. Someone was out there, and they weren't just watching anymore. The autumn chill deepened in Blackthorne, Vermont, as October 2001 gave way to gray skies and the rustle of leaves skittering across Main Street. The town's quiet charm, its clapboard houses, the neon flicker of Rosie's diner, the distant murmur of the Winooski River, masked a growing unease. Detective Maggie Callahan's reopened investigation into the 1985 disappearance of deputies Sarah Mitchell and Daniel Hayes had stirred something dark. The discovery of Sarah's badge and notebook, with its cryptic references to Arthur Hale and kids, pointed to a conspiracy buried for 16 years. Now, with a mysterious pickup truck tailing her and a footstep heard on her porch, Maggie knew she was treading on dangerous ground. Maggie's team, Deputy Tom Whitaker and forensic specialist Dr. Ellen Park, worked tirelessly at the sheriff's office, the air thick with coffee and the faint twang of an old Garth Brooks song on the radio. Ellen's analysis of Sarah's notebook revealed more than soil traces. A partial fingerprint, smudged but distinct, didn't match Sarah or Daniel. "It's not in the 1985 evidence logs," Ellen said, pushing up her glasses. "Someone else handled this notebook, and it wasn't documented." Tom, meanwhile, dug into the mill's history, uncovering that Victor Crane, the Burlington businessman, had sold the property in 1986 to a shell company linked to a Montreal address, just across the Canadian border. The proximity to Canada, a known smuggling route in the 1980s, raised red flags. Maggie suspected the mill was a hub for more than drugs. The mention of kids in Sarah's notebook haunted Maggie. She pulled records on the 3 missing teenagers from the early 1980s. Tommy Larson, 15, vanished in 1983. Emily Carter, 16, in 1984. And Joey Perez, 14, in 1985. Their cases had been labeled runaways, with minimal follow-up. Maggie visited the Blackthorne Library, its shelves smelling of old paper, to scan microfilm of local newspapers. A 1984 article caught her eye. A photo of Arthur Hale at a science fair, his arm around Emily Carter, who'd won first place for a physics project. Hale's name kept surfacing, a thread Maggie couldn't ignore. Her next stop was Sarah's mother, Ruth Mitchell, a 68-year-old widow who lived in a small house filled with memories of her daughter. Ruth, her silver hair pulled into a bun, welcomed Maggie with tea and a weary smile. The living room was a shrine to Sarah. Photos of her in her deputy uniform, a quilt she'd made, a cassette tape of Dolly Parton she'd loved. Ruth clutched a tissue as she spoke. Sarah was so proud to serve Blackthorne. But that last week, she was different, quiet, like something was eating at her. Ruth paused, her eyes glistening. "She left a letter for me. Said to open it if anything happened to her. I gave it to Sheriff Reed, but he said it didn't mean anything." Maggie's pulse quickened. "Do you remember what it said?" Ruth shook her head. "Something about the mill and a teacher. I thought it was just her nerves." Maggie made a mental note to track down that letter. Ruth's grief, raw after all these years, fueled Maggie's resolve. Back at the station, Tom uncovered a financial trail linking Victor Crane to Judge Harlan Booth. In 1985, Crane had donated heavily to Booth's re-election campaign, and Booth had dismissed a smuggling case involving a Canadian truck driver stopped near Blackthorne. Maggie suspected a network, Crane's business interests, Booth's judicial influence, and the mill as a front for illegal activity. But how did Hale fit in? Maggie decided to lean on Sheriff Reed, now 70 and living in a secluded cabin. Reed, a gruff man with a smoker's cough, was evasive when Maggie visited. "We did everything we could back then," he growled, avoiding her eyes. "Kids run off. Deputies get lost. It happens." His defensiveness only deepened Maggie's suspicions. Late that night, Maggie and Tom staked out the mill, parked in an unmarked car with the heater cranked against the cold. The mill's silhouette loomed against the starry sky, its broken windows like jagged teeth. "You think Hale was smuggling drugs?" Tom asked, sipping coffee. Maggie shook her head. Sarah's note said kids. "I think it's worse than drugs." As they watched, a flashlight beam flickered inside the mill. Maggie's hand went to her holster, but before they could move, a figure emerged, a teenage boy, no older than 16, sprinting into the woods. They gave chase, their boots pounding the damp earth, but the boy vanished into the trees. Back at the mill, they found fresh tire tracks and a discarded cigarette pack. Its brand popular in Quebec. The Canadian connection was undeniable. The next day, Maggie met Ed Ramsey at Rosie's diner to thank him for his find. Ed, nursing a coffee, mentioned something that stopped her cold. "Back in '85, my daughter said some kids at school were scared of Mr. Hale. Said he'd take them to the mill for special projects. I thought it was just talk." Maggie's mind raced. Hale, a respected teacher, involved in abducting children? It was almost unthinkable, but the pieces fit. Sarah's notes, the missing teens, the mill. She thanked Ed, her voice tight, and headed to the station to brief her team. That evening, as Maggie worked late, the station's power flickered. She heard a crash from the evidence room and drew her weapon, her heart pounding. The door was ajar, and files from the 1985 case were scattered on the floor. Someone had broken in, searching for something. Maggie's flashlight swept the room, landing on a single clue. A torn scrap of paper with Hale's handwriting, a formula for some chemical compound. As she bagged it, her phone rang, an anonymous voice, low and menacing. "Leave the past alone, detective, or you'll end up like Sarah." The line went dead, and Maggie stood frozen, the weight of the conspiracy closing in. Hale wasn't just a witness. He was at the heart of something monstrous, and someone was desperate to keep it buried. The November wind howled through Blackthorne, Vermont, rattling the windows of the sheriff's office, where Detective Maggie Callahan sat, her desk littered with evidence bags and old case files. The investigation into the 1985 disappearance of deputies Sarah Mitchell and Daniel Hayes had taken a sinister turn. Sarah's notebook, with its references to kids, and Arthur Hale, the former physics teacher, pointed to a chilling possibility. Hale had been involved in abducting children, using the abandoned Blackthorne textile mill as a base. The break-in at the station, the anonymous threat, and the chemical formula in Hale's handwriting had raised the stakes. Maggie's team, Deputy Tom Whitaker and forensic specialist Dr. Ellen Park, was stretched thin, but the truth was closer than ever, and it was uglier than Maggie had imagined. Maggie's first move was to confront Hale. She drove to his house, the forested hills cloaked in mist, the radio playing a faint Reba McEntire song that stirred memories of 1985. Hale answered the door, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking more than before. "I told you, I don't know anything," he said, but Maggie pressed, showing him the scrap of paper with his handwriting. Hale's face crumpled. "It's not what you think," he whispered, collapsing into a chair. "I didn't hurt those kids. I was trying to help them." Maggie's heart pounded. Help them how? Hale's story came in fragments. In the early 1980s, he'd noticed students, troubled teens like Tommy Larson and Emily Carter, being recruited by a man he knew only as Victor. Victor Crane, the Burlington businessman, had used Hale's science club as a cover, luring kids to the mill for experiments. Hale claimed he'd been coerced, threatened with exposure of a fabricated scandal if he didn't comply. Maggie was skeptical but listened. Hale said Sarah and Daniel had confronted him at the mill on July 12, 1985, demanding answers. "They thought I was the mastermind," he said, tears in his eyes. "But I told them about Victor and the others. They were going to blow it wide open." Then came the twist that stopped Maggie cold. Hale claimed Sarah and Daniel hadn't been killed that night. "They were taken," he said, "across the border. I don't know where, but Victor's people had a network in Canada. I thought they were dead until a few years ago." Hale produced a crumpled postcard, postmarked 1998 from Montreal, with no signature but a single line in Sarah's handwriting. "I'm alive. Don't look for me." Maggie's hands trembled as she bagged the postcard. Was Sarah alive, and hiding, or was this a cruel trick? Back at the station, Maggie shared Hale's story with Tom and Ellen. Ellen confirmed the postcard's ink and paper were consistent with the late 1990s, and the handwriting matched Sarah's notebook. Tom, pacing, said, "If they're alive, why stay hidden? And what about the kids?" Maggie's mind raced. The Canadian connection explained the tire tracks and cigarette pack from the mill. She suspected a cross-border trafficking ring, with Crane and Judge Harlan Booth protecting it from the U.S. side. But Hale's claim that he was a victim didn't add up. His chemical formula, analyzed by Ellen, matched a sedative used in the 1980s, suggesting he'd been more than a bystander. Maggie faced a personal conflict. Her trust in her team wavered. Tom had been acting cagey, taking calls outside, and avoiding questions about his father's logging business, which had operated near the mill in the 1980s. Was he hiding something? Maggie hated doubting him, but the anonymous threat echoed in her mind. She confided in Ellen, who urged her to confront Tom. Over coffee at Rosie's Diner, the jukebox playing an old Alabama song, Maggie asked Tom point-blank about his father. Tom's face hardened. Dad hauled logs, nothing else, he said. If you don't trust me, maybe I shouldn't be on this case. Maggie apologized, but the tension lingered, a crack in their partnership. The investigation deepened when Maggie tracked down Ruth Mitchell's missing letter. Buried in Sheriff Reed's personal files, which Maggie obtained with a warrant, was a note from Sarah dated July 11th, 1985. Mom, if I don't come home, check the mill's basement. Hale's involved, but it's bigger than him. Trust no one. The letter confirmed Hale's role and suggested Reed had suppressed it. Maggie and Tom searched the mill's basement, a damp labyrinth of rusted pipes and crumbling concrete. Hidden behind a loose wall panel, they found a locked metal box. Inside was a ledger listing names, dates, and payments, dozens of children, including Tommy, Emily, and Joey, with destinations in Quebec and Ontario. Hale's initials were on every page, alongside Crane's and Booth's. The scope of the trafficking network was staggering. Maggie's discovery came at a cost. As she and Tom left the mill, a dark van, eerily like the one reported in 1985, roared from the shadows, nearly running them off the road. Tom fired a warning shot, but the van vanished into the night. Maggie's hand shook as she called for backup, the ledger clutched to her chest. The attack confirmed the network was still active, protecting its secrets. Back at the station, Ellen found a new clue in the ledger, a name, Marie Dubois, listed as a contact in Montreal. A quick check revealed Dubois was a known alias for a Canadian smuggler active in the 1980s. Maggie knew she had to cross the border, but doing so risked alerting the network. The cliffhanger came late that night. Maggie, unable to sleep, drove to the station to review the ledger. As she parked, her headlights caught a figure slipping into the woods, a man, tall and lean, carrying a flashlight. She followed, her boots silent on the frost-covered ground, until she reached a clearing. There, illuminated by moonlight, was Arthur Hale, digging frantically in the earth. Maggie drew her weapon, her voice steady. "Hale, hands up." He froze, a small metal box in his hands, his face a mask of fear. "You don't understand," he stammered. "They'll kill me if I don't." A twig snapped behind Maggie, and she spun, her gun trained on the darkness. Someone else was out there, and Maggie was caught in the open, the ledger's secrets burning in her pocket. The moon hung low over Blackthorne, Vermont, casting a pale glow on the frost-dusted clearing where Detective Maggie Callahan stood, her service weapon trained on Arthur Hale. The former physics teacher clutched a metal box, his face pale with fear, as he stammered about them coming for him. The snap of a twig in the darkness behind Maggie sent her heart racing, but she held her ground. The ledger of a child trafficking network, linking Hale, Victor Crane, and Judge Harlan Booth, tucked inside her jacket. It was November 2001, and the reopened case of Deputies Sarah Mitchell and Daniel Hayes' 1985 disappearance had led Maggie to this moment. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the distant hum of a Hank Williams Jr. song from a nearby farmhouse reminded her of the Blackthorne she'd once known, a town now tainted by secrets. Maggie called out, "Show yourself." The shadows shifted, and Deputy Tom Whitaker stepped into the clearing, his hands raised. "It's me, Maggie," he said, his voice tense. "I followed you. Thought you might need backup." Maggie lowered her gun, relief mixing with lingering doubt about Tom's loyalty. Hale, trembling, dropped the box, which clattered on the frozen ground. Maggie cuffed him and opened it, revealing a stack of Polaroids, grainy images of children, including Tommy Larson and Emily Carter, bound and frightened, dated 1983 to 1985. Her stomach churned. "You said you were helping them." She spat at Hale. He sobbed. "I had no choice. Crane would have ruined me." Maggie radioed for backup, her voice steady despite the horror. Back at the station, Hale broke under questioning. He admitted to luring troubled teens to the mill under the guise of science projects, where Crane's men took them across the Canadian border for a trafficking ring run by Marie Dubois. Hale claimed he'd been blackmailed. Crane had fabricated evidence of an affair with a student, but his chemical expertise had been used to sedate the children. Sarah and Daniel, Hale said, had uncovered the operation and confronted him at the mill. Crane's enforcers, led by a man known only as Rue, had ambushed them, taking them to Canada. Hale believed they were alive, based on the 1998 postcard from Sarah. Maggie's hope flared, but so did her anger. Hale wasn't a victim, he was complicit. Maggie organized a raid on Victor Crane's Burlington estate, coordinating with the Vermont State Police and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Given the cross-border element, Ellen Park's forensic work confirmed Hale's fingerprints on the Polaroids and sedative vials found in the box, tying him directly to the abductions. Tom, eager to prove his loyalty, dug into his father's old logging records and found a delivery log from 1985 showing a shipment to the mill on the night Sarah and Daniel vanished. "Dad didn't know," Tom said, his voice heavy, but he hauled for Crane. "I should have told you sooner." Maggie nodded, their trust slowly mending. The raid took place at dawn, the sky streaked with pink as Maggie's team surrounded Crane's sprawling mansion. Inside, they found ledgers matching the one from the mill, detailing payments to Judge Booth and Sheriff Reed for covering up the operation. Crane, a silver-haired man in his 60s, tried to flee but was arrested in his study, surrounded by 1980s artifacts, rotary phone, a vinyl record of Waylon Jennings. In a hidden safe, Maggie found a tape labeled Mill, July 85. Her hands shook as she played it in the station's old VCR. The grainy footage showed Sarah and Daniel, bound and bruised, being loaded into a van by a man with a scar on his cheek, Rue the enforcer. Sarah's voice, faint but defiant, said, "You won't get away with this." The tape cut off, leaving Maggie reeling. Were they still alive? Maggie crossed into Canada with an RCMP liaison to track Marie Dubois. In Montreal, they raided a derelict warehouse listed in the ledger, finding evidence of a long-defunct trafficking hub, cots, restraints, and faded posters of 1980s Canadian bands. A hidden compartment held a journal, written in Daniel Hayes' handwriting, detailing his and Sarah's captivity in 1985. The final entry, dated August 1985, read, "They split us up. Sarah's alive, but I don't know for how long. If you find this, tell Ruth I'm sorry." Maggie's throat tightened. Ruth Mitchell deserved answers, but the journal confirmed Daniel's fate. A body, identified by dental records, was found in a Quebec morgue, a John Doe from 1986. Daniel had been killed, likely by Rue, but Sarah's fate remained uncertain. The confrontation with Judge Booth was Maggie's next move. Booth, now 75, lived in a stately Blackthorne home, his walls lined with photos from 1980s town events. Under pressure, he admitted taking bribes to dismiss smuggling cases, but denied knowing about the children. "Crane handled that," he said, his voice hollow. Maggie didn't believe him, but his confession was enough to arrest him. The town reeled as news of the arrest spread, the jukebox at Rosie's Diner falling silent for the first time in years. Maggie visited Ruth Mitchell to deliver the news. Ruth clutched Daniel's journal, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah might still be out there," she whispered, hope and grief intertwined. Maggie promised to keep searching, but the emotional toll was heavy. At the station, Ellen confirmed the sedative formula matched samples from the missing children's cases, sealing Hale's guilt. As Maggie left for the night, the weight of the confrontation settled over her. Crane and Booth were in custody. Hale was confessing, but Rue was still at large, and Sarah's fate hung in the balance. The radio played an old Emmylou Harris song, its mournful notes echoing Maggie's resolve. She'd dismantle this network, no matter the cost, but the scars it left on Blackthorne would linger. The winter of 2001 gripped Blackthorne, Vermont, with a quiet ferocity, blanketing the town in snow that muffled the hum of pickup trucks and the chatter at Rosie's Diner. Detective Maggie Callahan stood in the sheriff's office, her breath visible in the chilly air, as she reviewed the fallout from the arrests of Arthur Hale, Victor Crane, and Judge Harlan Booth. The child trafficking network they'd run through the Blackthorne textile mill in the 1980s, which claimed the lives of Deputy Daniel Hayes and countless children, had been exposed. Yet the question of Sarah Mitchell's fate lingered, a wound that refused to heal. The radio played a soft Johnny Cash tune, its somber chords a fitting backdrop for a town grappling with betrayal and redemption. Maggie's team finalized the case against the conspirators. Hale, broken by guilt, pleaded guilty to kidnapping and manslaughter. detailing how he'd used his position as a physics teacher to target vulnerable teens for Crane's network. His chemical sedatives had kept the children docile during their transfer across the Canadian border. Crane, the mastermind, faced federal charges for human trafficking and murder, his Burlington empire crumbling under the weight of seized ledgers and the damning 1985 tape showing Sarah and Daniel's abduction. Judge Booth, stripped of his legacy, confessed to accepting bribes to bury smuggling cases, though he claimed ignorance of the trafficking. Maggie doubted his denial but secured his conviction for corruption. Sheriff Reed, implicated for suppressing Sarah's letter, faced obstruction charges and a shattered reputation. The community reeled, its trust in institutions shaken. At a town hall meeting, held in the high school gymnasium, where Hale once taught, residents packed the bleachers, their faces etched with anger and grief. Ed Ramsey, the retired mechanic who'd found Sarah's badge, spoke up, his voice steady. "We trusted these men, but we're stronger than their lies. Let's make sure this never happens again." Maggie proposed reforms: mandatory training for law enforcement on trafficking, a whistleblower hotline, and a victims fund using Crane's seized assets. The town council, spurred by public outcry, adopted them, a small step toward healing. Maggie's search for Sarah led to a final breakthrough. With the RCMP's help, she tracked Rue, the scarred enforcer from the 1985 tape, to a Montreal prison, where he'd been jailed for unrelated crimes. Under interrogation, Rue, real name Claude Renault, confirmed Sarah had been sold to a trafficking ring in Quebec but escaped in 1986. He didn't know where she'd gone, but he recalled her defiance, spitting in his face, during her captivity. Maggie followed a lead from Sarah's 1998 postcard, tracing it to a women's shelter in Montreal. The shelter's records, though spotty, mentioned a woman matching Sarah's description who'd stayed briefly before vanishing. Maggie's heart sank, but a shelter worker provided a clue: a letter left behind, addressed to Ruth Mitchell, never mailed. Maggie delivered the letter to Ruth in her cozy living room, the scent of chamomile tea mingling with the crackle of a fireplace. Ruth's hands trembled as she read her daughter's words. "Mom, I'm alive but can't come home. They'd find me. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I love you." Ruth wept, clutching the letter, her grief tempered by closure. "She's out there, Maggie," Ruth said, her voice soft. "Maybe one day." Maggie nodded, tears in her eyes, vowing to keep an open file on Sarah. For Ruth, the letter was enough, a lifeline to her daughter's spirit. The emotional heart of Blackthorne's recovery came at a memorial service for Daniel Hayes and the missing children. On a snowy December day, the town gathered by the Winooski River, near a new monument, a granite stone engraved with the names of Tommy Larson, Emily Carter, Joey Perez, and Daniel. Ruth, wrapped in a scarf, laid a wreath for Sarah, her absence a quiet presence. Maggie spoke, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Daniel and these kids deserve better. Their courage exposed the truth. Let's honor them by rebuilding trust." The Blackthorne High Choir sang "Amazing Grace," its notes rising above the river's murmur, a moment of unity that echoed the town's 1980s church suppers and fairs. Maggie faced her own reckoning. The case had strained her bond with Deputy Tom Whitaker, but his honesty about his father's unwitting role in Crane's operation mended their trust. Tom stayed on, leading anti-trafficking training, while Dr. Ellen Park returned to Montpelier, her forensic work earning her a state commendation. Maggie, exhausted but resolute, accepted a role overseeing the county's new anti-corruption task force. At night, in her farmhouse, she'd sit by the fire, a Merle Haggard record spinning, reflecting on Sarah's laughter and the cost of justice. Epilogue 2010. 9 years later, Blackthorne had changed. The textile mill, once a symbol of decay, was razed, replaced by a community center named for Daniel Hayes, its walls adorned with photos of 1980s town events, a nod to nostalgia and resilience. Maggie, now 57, had retired from active duty but served as a consultant for Vermont's anti-trafficking unit. Her hair was streaked with gray, but her eyes held the same fire. She visited the center often, teaching kids about safety, her stories laced with lessons from the case that defined her career. One spring day, Maggie received an anonymous package at her farmhouse. Inside was a photo of a woman in her late 40s, standing by a lake, her face weathered but unmistakably Sarah's. A note read, "Thank you for never giving up." Maggie's hand shook as she pinned the photo to her fridge, next to one of her and Sarah at the 1984 fair. She didn't know where Sarah was, but the photo was proof. Her friend had survived, carving out a life beyond the shadows. Blackthorne's reforms took root. The Victims Fund supported survivors, and the whistleblower hotline led to new investigations. Rosie's Diner still stood, its jukebox now playing a mix of 1980s country and newer hits, a bridge between past and present. Ed Ramsey, now in his 70s, tended the memorial by the river, his quiet heroism a reminder of community strength. Maggie drove past it one evening, the sunset painting the hills gold, and felt a rare peace. The long shadow of 1985 had lifted, leaving a legacy of justice and hope, a town reborn, scarred but whole.